Welcome to this video reflecting on Theory U and Otto Scharmer. And as we move into this last formal text for your course, I would invite you to think about how these theories become practices that we can utilize. Because this video will take us into practice, as Scharmer's theory is a practice, a social technology. Theory U was developed out of MIT with several of wonderful scholars coming from a multidisciplinary point of view. Otto Scharmer was the one who worked with it most and captured it, but he shares it very collegially with a number of people. What Otto did to open us up to this Theory U was to look at how we are normally or normatively viewing the world. In his estimation, we look at the world through an iceberg model. We see our current reality very often really only on the surface. And as an East Coaster, who has spent many times with those huge, incredible creatures called icebergs, I will tell you, when we think about the fact we only see what they call the tip of the iceberg, it is an amazing feat and an amazing feature. We see only what's on top. Such a very small portion, I believe a ninth. So what we see, what we react to, what we relate to most often is what we see in terms of visible behaviors and actual happenings around with people. What are the things, Scharmer says, that doesn't appear? We see the activities, we see the situations, we hear the politics, we hear the news. What doesn't often appear is what's under, the layer of structures, the structures that hold things in place, like our worldviews and cosmologies that impact our behaviors. The structures that shape those things, very often we do not see. And buried underneath that layer are the paradigms of thought. And those deep paradigms of thought that permeate cultures across the world very often, or certainly in cluster cultures. The kinds of paradigms of thought that for women and men have very different roles and very different rights, and a woman's place is somewhere and a man's is somewhere else. That's an old paradigm that still functions in cultures, for example. Children should be seen and not heard. We're doing a very different movement with that. But those paradigms of thought that shape those who are poor or marginalized, we don't hear that they have been made poor, but we have assumptions about how they are there, and they're on a street and homeless. Very often those assumptions are caught up in the paradigms of thought that we are so unaware of. Very rarely do we go deeply enough to connect to the source of meaning and the source of our deepness to understand and come from those places of source. Scharmer then describes the three divides that most of our troubles can be organized into. The first great divide we're all very familiar with, the ecological divide, the eco-divide, that we are so separated now from the natural world from which we have sprung that we forget who we are. And we aren't conscious. And we know what's happening in terms of our ecological devastations and what's happening not just here in Canada but around the globe because of this. And we don't feel the impact, and we're very separated from feeling the experiences very often of that. The social divide, the divide that's between me and you, the us and them, whoever they are, those divides, the social divides between other human beings, is very significant. And we'll unpack these a little more. And the spiritual divide. When we talk about the spiritual divide, we're talking about the great division between myself and myself. Sharma calls it the capital S, that self that we're called into this world to be, that deep and dynamic self that is unique to us alone. Let's look a little bit at each one of these. The ecological divide. Depleting and degrading. Think about what's going on in Canada today. The discussions we have politically about pipelines or not pipelines. How do we sort that out? How do we sort that out without going deeply into understanding the structures and the mindsets that have shaped them? We know the facts. We know the facts. We're way overusing our resources. Our places of verdance and growth for agriculture is disappearing. And we know that looming on the horizon for our children are zooming food prices. The social divide. Globally, think about it. Less than $2, and that's American, because that's what we still measure things with. $2 American a day. 2.5 billion people subsist. They don't live, subsist. What about the polarization? Just take a look at how we voted in this past election, and you'll see the polarization. The deepening polarization. We talk about that from the United States. We're experiencing it ourselves. Who are the we and who are the they? Who is us and who is them? And the statistics in the United States that 1% of the population has more collective work than the entire 90% on the bottom. Quite significant. I've offered you some Canadian statistics, and one of the things I think that is most problematic for us is the poverty of children. We were challenged by the UN 15 years ago to do something about child poverty in Canada, and we're still challenged. We know the difficulties. This is the social divide, the us and them. The spiritual divide. The spiritual divide that reflects me from myself, from my current self, and from the self that I am called to be. Sharma talks about it as the self of my greatest potential. Again, what do we want to do with our one wild and precious life? That wild and precious life, our greatest potential. And how we see this spiritual divide is often manifested in the kinds of challenges we have with mental health, burnout, depression, the gap between our actions and who we really are, what I want to do, and what I end up doing. And the statistics that Sharma offered from 2000, that more than twice as many people died from suicide as died in wars, was a shocking one to me. If you're listening attentively to our news with suicides and deaths on some of our indigenous communities and some of our rural communities, we know this ourselves. We're trying in Canada to do something to stop this kind of separation and healing, to bring about healing. Think about PTSD and our first responders. We are at least conscious of something different. And these are world stats that I'm afraid haven't changed much. I give them to you here just for your own reflection and something to think about. What I find quite interesting is the fourth image with the little balloon with the dot in the middle. And that research has shown that those people who come from a belief of faith, a valued, deeply valued perspective, are less vulnerable to these. And that's about the divide between self and self. So, gloom and doom. How do we begin to address the divides? How do we begin to unpack and move in a different way? Back to those small things we said, leadership in our communities, our local communities, leadership in our schools, leadership in all those places. How do we begin? And Sharma uses this Theory U as a social technology that has been applied across the globe in a variety of ways to bring about good social change. The first step Sharma talks about is the step of learning to listen differently. In order to do as he says, come down the U, we have to learn to listen differently. And in fact, he talks about in leadership that listening is probably one of the most difficult things we do, and one of the things that is neglected and we do most poorly. So just have a peek at these. So the downloading, it's the chat that you do, passing in the corridor, just hello, how are you, da da da, and you keep it all up in a nice thing because you hear what you want to hear and you're just operating from there and not expecting anything and not giving anything. The kind of listening where we stop and reflect and open ourselves to the listening is to see somebody who's doing something differently from us. We don't know the answer. So what we suspend there, that VOJ, is the voice of judgment. I already know what this guy is going to say because he said the same thing for the last 10 years. Having an open mind means that I actually listen to what he says and try to hear the words and beyond the words, where he is coming from. It's the seeing that we do with fresh eyes when we suspend our voice of judgment. We open our mind. Change doesn't happen with simply an open mind. Our real listening doesn't happen there either. It has to come from an open heart. It has to come from the place where we suspend our cynicism. I've worked at this for so long and nothing ever changes. The voice of cynicism, redirecting our thinking from past into what's possible. And that means opening the heart. That's even harder than opening the mind. The deepest level, when we are open to what is emerging from the source, from the center of myself, from the source of life, is letting go so something can come. Letting go so something new can come. So it's no longer what I've always thought I heard. Something new is emerging. And in order for me to enter that and act with it, because will is about acting, will is about doing, I have to let go of things that I know, perhaps. And that brings fear. And the voice of fear, what I've always done, what we've always done. And then we move up the U, the possibilities. But those listening patterns, those theories of listening are so important. And I want you to hear the man himself. And the video that is posted for you, you'll see the website there. But Sharma, just a short video, 8 minutes or so, and really, really open yourself to that. What are you hearing? And when you've had a chance to do that, I would invite you to just see where you are with your work and think about how we can help one another, be of help one another. Do your postings and connect. Connect and see if among the three of you, and I will be joining in those conversations, is there something that would be helpful to you as you're looking at the second half and last part of your course. Now I know you have your written assignment is due, is it this week or next week? This time next week, whenever you view this video. But if you start to connect with those things, and I'm hoping that the 2 videos that I have posted previous to this one will help open up those texts and your own thinking a little to help you mine your resources for your second assignment, which of course feeds into your major learning for the course. So read Sharma's text, watch the video on the levels of listening, and this is the third thing, which is perhaps most challenging, is practice them. Practice them in the ordinary places of your life. You know, when you're just sitting and having a cup of coffee with somebody, what kind of listening are you doing? Sense yourself and taste what's going on in that inner and outer world to see how you're listening and where you are. And perhaps you'll have an experience of listening or not being listened to, or really being listened to well, that you might want to share when we come together in a couple of weeks. So, hold your support. Think about what it is that you are doing with your one wild and precious life. Enjoy the social technology of Theory U. Until we meet again.